Hey everybody, today on Concrete Play we're going to talk about context generation. I've actually got a lot of context generation talks planned, sort of, but we're going to start with the simplest one I can think of. If you've generated a lot of random content for the player, you've probably run into what's called the oatmeal problem. So you're generating planets for a space game, and you generate all sorts of planets, and they've got all sorts of fun traits. And how does the player think about them? The player says, "Wow, these planets are boring." And you're like, "What? Really? Fine, I'll step it up. This one's cracked open, and this one's been eaten by a space whale, And it's like they're still not very interesting. And at some point, you have to start to realize that the problem isn't the randomization. It's not that you can change what random elements you're putting in and get what they're looking for. The problem is that there's something fundamentally broken about how they're engaging with the content you're creating. And you can see that in No Man's Sky. There has never been a game that generates a wider diversity of planets, and every single one of those planets is as boring as possible, because you can't engage with them. I'll give you another example. You are creating random NPCs for a game. And so you give them stats, and you put down some personality traits or something, and you generate faces maybe. And you find that people don't care. No matter what you do, none of the players seem to care one bit about the NPCs. They'll just choose whoever's got the best stat and roll with it. Some of them might get attached, but it's very rare. So you decide to push it, and so you create NPCs that are dressed in Barney costumes. And now the players care for about 2 seconds, and then now it's just another NPC that looks stupid. And maybe you collect them. Maybe you collect all the Barney NPCs you can find because they're rare, but it's not really something that makes you immersed in the game world. It's just you collecting rare trinkets. This is a way of giving context. You're putting context into the game world, and it's context the player is familiar with, so it's a metagame context. There's no reason for these to be dressed in Barney suits in the game world, or if there is, it's very flimsy. The real reason is because you want to appeal to the player, and a Barney suit is the way to do that. But that wears off almost instantly. It's not in the game. It's something the player brings to the table, and once it's been brought, the game can't develop it any further. That's done now. Even if I have 100 of these Barney-suited people as my minions, it won't be a different story. It won't be a better story. It won't be a worse story. The game doesn't even care. Same with something like, oh, you're hiring freedom fighters, and one of your freedom fighters is an 80-year-old lady, and that's really cool. And everybody's like, oh, look, an 80-year-old lady. I want to play an 80-year-old lady freedom fighter. Awesome. That works once, as I said, and then it's just a curiosity. How many 80-year-old ladies can you recruit? There's not really any substance to it. It doesn't make the game different or more interesting. And that's because this is a shallow context. It's an injected context. Moreover, it's an expensive one. It takes a lot of time and effort to develop little old lady animations and Barney suits. And then they're eaten up by the player, and they're gone. That doesn't mean these are bad investments, especially when they're part of a reveal. This can get a lot of really, really good player attention. But when you're in the game, you need to be generating something that has context within the game. How do you do that? Well, let me give you some basic ideas. You're wandering space. Let's say you're playing Mass Effect, except for we've taken out all the fun parts, and it's just flying around space, scanning planets. So you scan a planet, and it's either randomly generated or very, very carefully written up or whatever, right? And then you scan another one, and then you scan another one, and then you scan another one. It doesn't matter how awesome these planets are. One of them could be a black hole, and one of them could have been eaten by a space whale. And the player is not going to care. At most, the player will raise an eyebrow and then go back to scanning planets. That's because these are too far from the player. The player isn't engaged with this content. They see the content and they make a note of it, and then they move on. That's why all of the planets in No Man's Sky feel the same, because you engage with them in the same way. So how can we make it so that you engage with these planets in different ways? Well, obviously we could let you fly down to the planet and engage with it by getting off and running around, but again, that's probably not going to happen. The player isn't going to be too terribly interested in doing that. So, what are some methods we can use? Well, the easiest method is to have one of the NPCs pop in and say, oh boy, I remember that one. I was on that one when I was a kid, and it was terrible. It sucked, and I hated it, or whatever, right? One of the NPCs has an opinion on a random piece of content. Now, if every time you roll up to some arbitrary world, one of your NPCs walks up, one of your crew members walks up and says, like, oh, I grew up there, or oh, I have family there, that'll get old real fast. But if it's just one piece of content per system, then it gives a little bit of poignance to that one piece of content, and it also reminds you of who your crew members are. If Tally rolls up and says, oh yeah, we tried to settle there, but it made us sick. That's my Tally helmet, can you tell? We tried to settle there, but it made us sick. Then you know more about Tally. You're reminded about Tally, and you also know more about the planet. The planet's randomly generated condition has meaning to you. Not a whole lot of meaning, but it has a little bit of meaning. Now, why do you want just a little bit of meaning? Because you can always leverage it. Once you have a hook, once you have a lever, you can push it. You can get the player to care more and more and more, and you can pull them down into the content. So if you just seed one thing in a system as a thing of NPC interest, then you can have that one thing matter a little bit. How do you choose which NPC and which thing? Well, every NPC has specific interests. So if there is a world that is covered in ancient ruins, then Liara rolls up and says, yeah, that world's of interest to me. And if there's a world covered in element 0, then Jack rolls over and says, ah, that's a psychic world. I want to go there. These are the sorts of things where every one of your characters has specific interests, and you just have those tied to specific randomized traits in the universe. And it should work out pretty well. It does depend on you having a fair number of variants when you're generating things randomly, but the basic idea holds true. And of course, it's very flexible. If you have a different set of crew members, then it still works fine. It doesn't require you to have Jack. It doesn't require you to have Tally. It doesn't require you to have anybody. You can just have whoever you happen to have, and they'll comment on whatever happens to be around. The other things that you can do usually involve working with that little piece of leverage. For example, once an NPC has made you notice a world, you can put a mission on that world. Something like, rescue a stranded person. This world's covered in storms, and in Mass Effect you'd be like, oh, who cares? I'm not going to go down to the world, so I don't care. But if this world's covered in storms, and also one of your NPCs rolls up, Rex rolls up and says, oh, I lost a squad down there once. I wonder if they're still there or something. And then there's like a emergency call, a reconnaissance team from Rex's homeworld went to find the scouts and got stuck in the storms. Now that is a mission that you care about. If it was just someone crashed on the planet, you'd be like, okay, fine. I don't really care about the planet. I don't really care about the people, but I guess it's a sub-mission, a sub-quest. We'll go do it. But once you've got Rex involved, that gives you the hook, that gives you the lever that you need to make the player care about the mission, which in turn gives you the lever that you need to make the content matter. Once you get them down into that storm, well, guess what? They're going to feel the content up close and personal. They're going to know what makes this planet unique. And that's really what this is about. It's about breaking the distance between the player and the content. You need to make sure that the content isn't simply something that you see from a light year away and get to note in a catalog. It's something where the player has to have their face rubbed into it. Not all the time, but enough of the time that they realize this content does matter. If a world has storms, well, they know what the storm is like. They've been in storms, and they may have to be in storms again real soon. So that will make that concept matter more. You can do this in a lot of other ways as well. I've shown you a very gentle way. NPC comments, there's a mission. NPC comments, there's a mission. Feels like it might get old. I wouldn't know. I don't think so. Not for randomly generated stuff. I feel like it would flow pretty well. But imagine if you didn't have this progression or wanted a change in progression. Well, what could you do? Well, you roll into a star system and then you have a cutscene. And one explanation later, you're now crashed on the world and you're exploring the outside in your hazmat suits going, oh my gosh, we got stuck on this world. We need to find a fram jammer to repair our Hugelplops. Oh no, a fram jammer? Well, there's one detected 20 clicks that way. Let's get walking. That is a perfectly reasonable way to jam a player's face into content. You just literally grab them and throw them into the content. How well that works depends on what the player's expectations are. In some games you can do this, in other games you might not really be able to because the player is not used to losing control. So that sort of thing, it really does depend. But if you've got like intelligent NPCs, by which I mean if your NPCs matter and they often have their own opinions, whether it's scripted or randomized, then the player is usually going to accept a cutscene in which the NPCs insist that you do something, and then you do it. Like if you rocked up to this storm world, and it was like oh, well, that storm world, how do we make the player care that it's a storm world? Well, Rex rocks up and he says, oh, I got some people on that world I need to rescue. Let's go do it. And you're like, okay, well, we'll go do it. And then you just do it. There's no player controls really involved. The player is just swept along for the ride. And that's something that many players will accept. If they're out there just randomly gallivanting around the stars, they're not on a specific mission, then this isn't them getting sidetracked. This is them doing missions. If they're already on a mission, they're trying to get somewhere, then obviously you don't want this to happen because it would just interfere with the flow of your game. But it's just one more way to push the player into the content. And that's really the secret here. If you want the player to care about the content, you have to make them engage with the content. And this is a very basic setup. This is a setup that involves a little bit of NPC scripting, a little bit of mission scripting, but it's something that you can probably get away with in most exploration games. I also have some more advanced ideas on how to make this sort of thing matter in a long-term way, and through multiple iterations of ship tiers and stuff like that. But that's going to have to wait for another day because I want to keep this one fairly simple and concrete, something that you can do pretty easily. If you have any other ideas on how to get the player to engage with the content in fun ways, feel free to leave it down below because I am always interested in seeing other people's approaches. Have a good one.